They said it was cursed, a black giant of a horse that no rope could hold, no rider could stay on. Men who tried ended up broken, some near dead, until even the auctioneer gave up offering it for scraps. No one dared raise a hand. No one except a weathered cowboy with nothing left but the dust on his boots, 20 worn dollars, and a wedding ring strung on a chain close to his heart. When he laid that ring on the table, laughter filled the yard. But what followed, what rose from the bond between a ruined man and a beast the world had abandoned, would shake an entire valley and prove that sometimes the most reckless trade carries the greatest destiny. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The Red Mesa Valley had once been a place of quiet abundance. In spring, the grass rippled in green waves across the basin floor. Cattle lowed from distant pastures, and the cottonwoods along the creek shivered with silver leaves. Old-timers used to say the valley could feed 3 families for every mile of fence line, and for generations it had. But the rains had stopped coming, and the land had changed. By midsummer, the earth lay cracked like old pottery, the topsoil lifting in brittle sheets whenever the wind cut through. Dust rolled across the basin like smoke, burying fence posts halfway and painting the horizon in a haze of brown. No one remembered the last real storm. The sky had hardened into a pale, merciless blue that promised nothing and delivered less. Jonah Hale rode that horizon like a shadow of another time. At 48, he still carried the frame of a working cowboy. Broad shoulders, long legs made for a saddle hands, weathered into raw hide. But the years had carved into him. His dark hair had thinned at the crown, his beard was salted heavy with gray, and his eyes carried the hollowness of a man who had stared at too much empty ground. People said he looked like something left over from the old ranching days, a relic the present had forgotten to bury. Jonah did little to prove them wrong. Once he had been more than a ghost of the past. He had owned 300 acres of grazing land on the southern rim, not large by frontier standards, but enough to keep a few hundred head of cattle and give him the dignity of calling it his own. Mornings had been filled with simple rituals, the smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen stove, the scrape of boots on the porch, the sight of his wife Anna standing at the window, her apron dusted with flour, watching him check the fence line as if nothing in the world could ever change. But it had. The first summer without rain turned the creek into a thread of mud. By autumn, it was gone completely. Grass brown thinned and then lay down dead, leaving bare dirt where cattle had once grazed belly deep. Jonah watched ribs surface under hides that had been sleek and shining the year before. He sold off a dozen steers, then another dozen, the money vanishing into the black hole of interest payments at Cattleman's Bank. By the end of the second year, the herd was a memory, and so was the land. He remembered the day the bank men came. They wore clean boots and spoke with the politeness of executioners. Jonah had tried to argue about weather cycles, about the promise of rain, about the dignity of a man keeping his land. But the mathematics of loss had no mercy. His debts were greater than his cattle, greater than his fences, greater even than his name. The ranch was sold at auction, and Jonah walked away with nothing but a truck, a scattering of rusted tools, and a wedding ring that refused to leave his neck. If losing the land was a wound, losing Anna was the death blow. She had been his partner in everything since they were barely more than kids, he with the dreams of a spread of his own. She with the kind of stubborn faith that could carry a man through droughts and debt. When the creek first dried, she'd taken a job at the diner in town, pouring coffee for other ranch families who were bleeding just as badly. She worked double shifts, smiling through exhaustion, bringing home tip money folded neatly, like it could hold the ranch together. At night, she would place her hand on Jonah's and whisper, "We'll make it, just hold on." but hearts can only carry so much. It was during the second brutal summer that Anna collapsed in the kitchen, the cracked linoleum floor cool beneath her cheek. The doctor called it heart failure. Jonah called it the moment the world ended. He buried her on a hill overlooking the dead pasture, the same ground where they had once spoken of raising children. Only a handful of friends stood with him that day, dust swirling around their boots, the preacher's voice thin against the wind. Jonah marked the grave with a cedar cross and stood long after the others left, until the stars came and the coyotes sang from the ridges. After Anna, there was nothing left to fight for. 6 months later, Jonah's life had shrunk to the size of an old Ford pickup. The paint was sun-peeled, the bed lined with rust, the cab carrying everything he owned, a bedroll, a few spare shirts, a toolbox missing half its wrenches. He slept across the bench seat, his boots for a pillow, sweating through desert nights, or freezing when the cold cut down from the mountains. Some mornings he woke with his back screaming, unsure what town he had parked in the night before. Work came in scraps. Fixing fences for a neighbor, stacking hay in another man's barn, hauling logs out of a draw for a rancher too old to do it himself. $50 here, a hot meal there. Enough to keep gas in the tank and hunger off his back. He had become a hired hand without a place to belong, drifting where the wind pushed him. The people of Red Mesa had grown used to the sight of him. They watched him from storefronts and cafe windows with the polite pity reserved for fallen men. Some whispered, "That's Jonah Hale, used to have a ranch out past Dry Hollow." Others were less kind. "All that's left is the ghost. He lost his cattle, lost his woman, lost his damn mind." Jonah heard them sometimes, but he never answered. The truth was sharper than any insult they could throw. The one thing he had refused to lose was Anna's wedding ring. It hung on a leather thong around his neck, a plain band of gold dulled by years of work and grief. Bankers had asked if he wanted to pawn it. Friends had suggested he trade it for cash when times got thin. Jonah never considered it. That ring was more than metal. It was mornings of coffee and laughter. It was the sound of Anna's voice telling him to hold on. It was the life they had dreamed of, but never kept. On long nights in the cab of the truck, he would take it off the cord and hold it between thumb and forefinger, feeling its weight. Sometimes he whispered to it, as if Anna could still hear, confessing the things he had no one else to tell: his failures, his loneliness, his anger at a sky that refused to rain. Other times, he only sat in silence, for the ring warm against his palm, and the last ember of a fire that once burned bright. He knew it was absurd clinging to a piece of gold when the rest of his life had turned to dust. But in the quiet of those nights, the ring was the single thread that kept him from collapsing entirely. Without it, he feared he would vanish, like the ranch, like the herd, like Anna herself. With it, he endured. And so Jonah Hale remained half man, half shadow, trailing the ruins of a past life across the Red Mesa Valley, carrying in his chest a grief too heavy for words, and around his neck the one fragile proof that love once given does not die. The sun rose hard and merciless over Silver Creek, laying its weight on the auction yard like a hammer. By mid-morning, the dust was already red in the air, thick enough to scratch throats and coat every hat brim with grit. The place smelled of hay and manure, of tobacco smoke and sweat, the mingled perfume of a rural economy trying to wring blood from a stone. Ranchers had come in from every corner of Red Mesa County, their trucks lined up against the fence, their trailers rattling with restless cattle. They moved through the yard with weary eyes and guarded wallets, knowing most of what passed through the sale ring would fetch half of what it was worth. Hard times had a way of dragging down not just prices, but pride. The clang of the auctioneer's hammer cut through the noise, sharp and relentless, dictating the rhythm of the morning. A thin cow shuffled out into the ring ribs, showing through its hide. and Clint Weaver, broad-shouldered, red-faced, with a voice that could shake dust from rafters, started the bidding. $50, 50, who'll give me 50, 40, then 40 to start. Come on, boys, she's still walking. Someone muttered. Barely and laughter followed hollow as the empty water tanks that dotted the ranches. Jonah Hale stood at the edge of the crowd, had pulled low arms folded across his chest. He looked like any other drifter passing through, but he watched the parade of animals with an intensity that betrayed memory. Every cow let out, every calf sold cheap, carried the echo of what he had lost. 3 years ago, it had been his cattle in the ring, thin hides and wide eyes sold for pennies on the dollar. He remembered standing where those other ranchers stood now, tasting the same bile of failure as his life was sold away, one bawling steer at a time. Nobody paid Jonah much attention. He was a fixture of sorts, a man who appeared at auctions and roundups with his hands in his pockets looking for work or maybe a miracle. Folks had grown used to pretending he wasn't there. The sale moved fast. Old mares that once pulled wagons, scrawny steers that should have been fattened but weren't, a string of calves that went for less than the cost of raising them. Ranchers cursed under their breath, spitting into the dirt when bids fell flat. Clint's voice stayed steady, but sweat gleamed on his temples, and his hammer seemed to fall heavier with each lot. Then the rhythm broke. It began with a murmur at the back of the yard, a ripple of voices that rolled forward like wind through grass. Men craned their necks, boots scuffing in the dirt, hats lifting as they turned toward the source of the noise. A trailer had pulled into the yard, different from the rest. Its bed carried a steel cage, the kind used for bulls, too mean for ordinary fences. Inside, something moved. The crowd pressed closer, curiosity edging out boredom. What stepped into sight was no ordinary horse. It was a mountain of black muscle shoulders rising nearly 6.5 feet, necks arched like carved iron. Its coat shone like polished obsidian, every ripple of its frame betraying raw, unspent power. The mane hung in tangled ropes, dark as coal, and when the animal turned its head, the sun caught in its eyes, amber flecked with something that looked almost red. The horse threw itself against the bars of the cage, the sound ringing like thunder. Steel groaned and rattled. Several men stumbled back, swearing. "Jesus almighty," someone hissed. "That ain't a horse, that's a damn devil." Children squealed and were pulled behind their mothers' skirts. Even the seasoned Cowboy's men who had ridden broncs and stared down bulls took half a step back. The name spread quickly through the yard, carried on whispers sharp with fear. Ironhoof. The beast slammed its forelegs down, hooves striking the trailer floor with a sound that shook through the boards like cannon fire. The nickname fit. Jonah felt the impact in his chest, as if the ground itself had reacted. For a long moment, he simply stared, caught between awe and something deeper. He had seen dangerous horses before, mean-tempered studs that would bite the hand that fed them wild mustangs that no saddle could tame. But this was different. This animal carried not just strength, but defiance, a fury that no cage could hope to contain. Ray Hollister, the horse trader who had hauled the beast in, climbed onto the trailer with a grin that was more grimace than pride. His voice was pitched loud for the crowd. Caught him up near the rim rock, took 6 men and a corral of steel to hold him. Damn near killed 3 cowboys just getting him here. The stories came tumbling out as they always did. One rider thrown 20 feet, his back broken against a fence post. Another dragged half a mile when his rope tangled before it snapped. A third nearly crushed beneath hooves that struck like hammers. Ironhoof had destroyed stables, chewed through reins, shattered halters like twine. Some said he was cursed. Others said he was simply born wrong, too big and too angry for the world to hold. Devil horse, a rancher muttered, spitting into the dirt. Should have been shot on sight. Ray spread his arms wide. Could have done that, sure. But figured maybe someone here's got the guts and the skill to make something out of him. Or hell, maybe just hang his head on the barn wall. Either way, he's for sale. Clint Weaver looked like a man about to sell dynamite to children. He wiped his forehead with a handkerchief, cleared his throat, and raised his hammer. His voice, usually unshakable, came out rough. $200 opening bid for this fine specimen. 200 who'll give me 2 silence. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. A few men chuckled, but no one moved. Come on now. Clint pressed, forcing cheer. You'll never see another horse like this. 200, 150, then 150 to start. Someone barked a laugh. I'd sooner pay for a rattlesnake, another added. Only thing he's good for is fertilizer. Ironhoof answered with a scream that was half horse, half storm. He reared within the cage hooves, battering the steel until sparks flew. The children cried out. Women pulled them further back. Men muttered prayers under their breath, as if afraid the beast could hear their doubts. Clint tried again, but the words fell flat. No hands lifted, no numbers called. For all the wealth of cattle and land represented in that yard, not one man wanted the burden of Ironhoof. The mood soured into mockery. Whoever buys him will be dead before sunrise. Hell, I'll give $10 for his hide, make a rug out of it. Quit wasting our time, Clint. Get rid of the monster. Ray Hollister spat into the dust and shoved his hat back on his sweaty forehead. The fat horse dealer had been pacing behind the steel cage like a man cursed with bad luck, his stained duster flapping with every step. He was red from heat and frustration, and when the crowd kept backing away from the black giant inside, his temper finally snapped. Enough of this, Ray barked, slapping the bars with an open hand. If none of you sorry bastards wants him, I'll have him shot by sundown. This brute's nothing but trouble cost me, feed broke 2 corrals, nearly took my head off this morning. He ain't worth the iron that holds him. A ripple of agreement moved through the men gathered. Some nodded, some muttered curses at the animal that still pounded its hooves like thunder against the trailer floor. In Ray's eyes, Ironhoof wasn't a miracle or a prize. He was a business failure meat on the hoof that had cost him more than he'd ever get back. Jonah Hale heard the words, but didn't move at first. He stood in the back like a shadow, arms, crossed hat brim hiding his face. The laughter, the fear, the dismissal, all of it sounded too familiar. It was the same tone men had used when they talked about him washed up, finished nothing but a burden to himself. Something shifted in Jonah, then quiet, but sharp as a spur digging into flesh. He found himself stepping forward. The crowd parted, slightly surprised to see him break from their ranks. A woman tugged her husband's sleeve and whispered, "What's he doing?" Not that, surely not. Jonah walked toward Clint Weaver's stand boots, crunching in the dust. When he reached the edge of the platform, he lifted his head. His voice came out rough with disuse, but steady. "I'll buy him." For a heartbeat, silence. Then the yard erupted in laughter. "Hell, he's crazier than the horse," one man shouted. "Better start digging his grave now." Another barked. The sound rolled across the yard like a wave, and even Clint's hammer hand froze in midair. Jonah didn't flinch. He reached slowly into the pocket of his worn jeans and pulled out a crumpled bill. It was $20, the last note he had folded and refolded until the corners were as soft as cloth. He placed it carefully on the wooden table in front of Clint. The paper looked pitiful there, a lone scrap against the sun-bleached boards. "That's all I got," Jonah said. 20. Clint frowned, his face tight with sympathy. "Jonah, opening bid was 200. 20 won't get you the nails to hang a bridle on him." Ray Hollister snorted. 2 10s for a monster like that ain't enough to buy one of his damn hooves. The crowd roared again, voices full of scorn. "Man's broken, starving, and he thinks he can tame the devil," someone jeered. "Better save that bill for beans." Hale Jonah stood unmoving. His hand rose slow, deliberate to the leather thong around his neck. The crowd's laughter faltered as they watched him draw it out from under his shirt. There, dangling in the sun, was a plain gold wedding band. Jonah held it in his palm thumb, brushing the smooth circle once, before he lifted it high for all to see. His voice carried low but clear across the yard. "And this," he said, "this is the rest of the price. The only thing of value I got left. The life I lived, the love I buried, all of it's in this ring." Silence. Even the horses shifting in their pens seemed to pause. No one had expected him to offer that. No one thought he'd give away the one piece of himself he still clung to. For Jonah, it was more than gold. It was Anna, her laughter in the kitchen, her hand in his across the years, her grave on the hill. Giving it up felt like peeling away skin, like offering his own heart. But his eyes never wavered. Around him, murmurs rose again, softer this time. God help him, he's serious. Mad as a coyote, trading a wife's memory for a demon horse. One man chuckled harshly. "Guess grief makes fools of us all." But Clint Weaver only stared at Jonah, his expression heavy with something that looked like pity, maybe even respect. He started to open his mouth to talk Jonah down from the ledge, but the words died in his throat. Ray Hollister stepped closer, eyes narrowing at the ring. The calculation was visible in his face, his merchant's mind ticking over. He reached out a stubby finger, tapped the band, and let out a grunt. "Gold," he said flatly. "Worth more than 200 sure enough." He smirked greedy satisfaction, cutting through his earlier frustration. "Deal. You can have the beast." Clint looked between them, uneasy. "Jonah, you don't have to do this. You don't owe anyone a thing. Walk away before you regret it." Jonah slid the $20 bill and the ring together across the table. His hand trembled, but his gaze was clear, carved out of something older than fear. "I'm sure." The pen scratched across the paper, his name signing away what little he had left. When it was done, Jonah straightened the weight of decision heavy on his shoulders, but unshakable. "Then it's yours," Ray declared, stuffing the ring into his pocket with a grin that made the crowd mutter, "God help you, Hale." The handlers moved to open the cage. The air itself seemed to tense as the bolts came loose. The door swung wide, and Ironhoof surged forward with a roar that rattled ribs. Dust exploded under his hooves. Men cursed and stumbled back. Jonah didn't raise a whip. He didn't shout. He only gripped the lead rope, the coarse fibers burning against his palm. For a heartbeat, the horse reared muscles coiled with violence. But then, inexplicably, Ironhoof lowered his head. He snorted once, pawed the dirt, and stepped forward, following Jonah's lead rope out of the trailer. The crowd gasped. No saddle, no bridle, no force. Just a broken man walking ahead, and a black giant choosing somehow to follow. Laughter started again, mixed with curses and disbelief. He'll be trampled before sundown. Trading love for death, that's what he's done. But Jonah didn't answer. He walked straight eyes forward, the beast at his back, and the voices of doubt falling away behind him. The trail to Dry Hollow Creek wound narrow between red bluffs and dry scrub. By late afternoon, the sun was a copper coin, heavy and low-baking every stone it touched. Jonah Hale drove the black giant slowly a length of rope, trailing from the halter dust rising around their boots. The place he led Ironhoof was no paradise. Dry Hollow had once held a thin stream that meandered through the cottonwoods, but now it was little more than a scar in the earth, cracked and thirsty, with only a few stubborn pools glinting in the fading light. Yet Jonah felt something when he looked at it. Years ago, in better times, he and Anna had camped here back when they were young and reckless enough to ride with nothing but bedrolls and laughter. He remembered her cooking beans over the fire, remembered her hair lifting in the wind as she called across the creek. That memory alone was enough to steady him. If he was going to start again anywhere, it would be here. He set up camp with the little he had: a patched canvas tent, a ring of stones for a fire, and a pen built from scavenged poles hammered into hard ground. The corral leaned like an old drunk, but it was something. He unrolled a blanket inside the tent, set his few tools in a corner, and lit a small blaze as night came creeping over the valley. It was poor bare, nearly laughable by ranch standards, but it was a beginning. Ironhoof wanted no part of it. The first night before Jonah had even laid his head down, the rope snapped taut. The stallion bellowed, muscles bunching as he ripped free from the hitching post. With a crash like thunder, he plowed into the rough corral. The wooden rails scattered, tumbling end over end, as though they were straw. Dust rose, and Ironhoof's scream carried across the canyon walls, sharp and furious enough to make coyotes fall silent. Jonah lunged for the trailing rope, seized it with both hands, and was dragged like a rag through the dirt. His boots carved lines in the dust, his arms straining till they burned. For a heartbeat, he thought he could hold the monster, but one jerk of the stallion's neck threw him sprawling. Hooves crashed down inches from his skull. He rolled aside just in time, grit filling his mouth. By the time he scrambled up, Ironhoof was rearing again, slamming the ground with fury enough to make the earth tremble. Easy boy Jonah wheezed, chest heaving. He stumbled forward, rope burning across his palms, trying again and again. Each attempt ended the same. His knees buckled, his shoulders screamed, his body bruised by the black wall of power that would not yield. At last, he lay flat on his back, in the dust chest, rising and falling, while the stallion stood above the wreckage of rails and poles, triumphant, untamed. The days that followed did not grow easier. Jonah tried to feed him, holding out handfuls of dry hay salvaged from town. The horse lunged, not for the food, but with teeth-bared ears, flat hooves striking the ground in warning. Once, when Jonah stepped too close, Ironhoof's hind legs lashed out. The blow missed by inches, but the wind of it spun Jonah sideways, sending him tumbling down a patch of rocks. He landed hard, shoulders screaming with pain, that left him clutching the joint through the night. Neighbors, if they could be called that, heard about his efforts. Word spread fast in small country. Some rode by out of curiosity, leaning on their saddles to watch from a distance. "He'll kill Hale before the week's out," one man muttered. "Better to let the traders take that beast for glue," another sneered. Their laughter drifted away with them, but Jonah felt it cut deep. Still, each morning he rose before the sun and walked back to the corral with a new bruise, a new limp, and a determination that hardened rather than cracked. Instead of whips, Jonah chose patience. When Ironhoof exploded, he simply gathered the shattered rails, set them up right again, and sat quietly by the fire until the stallion's breath slowed. When he was thrown to the ground, he stood, brushed the dirt from his jeans, and returned without anger. At night, after the flames died low, he spoke aloud, as if Anna could hear, but his words were meant for the great dark shape watching from the shadows of the broken pen. "You don't owe me a thing, big fella," he murmured, "but we're stuck with each other. You've got no one else. Neither do I." His voice was low, weary, yet honest, carrying the kind of truth that animals seem to understand better than men. Ironhoof never answered, only stared with those burning eyes. But sometimes, the stallion's ears twitched toward him, listening. One night a windstorm rolled through Dry Hollow. It screamed between the rocks, rattled the canvas of Jonah's tent, and sent sparks swirling from the fire. Jonah sat with his coat collar pulled high, staring at the silhouette of Ironhoof against the dark. The horse stood broad, an immovable mane, whipping eyes glowing in the firelight like coals. Jonah leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and let the words fall out of him. "It's just us now, big boy," he whispered. "No one's coming to save either of us. So here's the deal. We live together or we die together. No halfway." The wind carried the promise into the night. Ironhoof did not move, did not snarl or strike. He only stood, firelight flickering in his gaze, as if measuring the man who dared speak such a vow. From that night on, their struggle shifted. Jonah began to think of it as a dance. Each day he tried something small, something careful. He set a bucket of water just outside the stallion's reach, then stepped back. Ironhoof eyed him, pawed the earth, then bent to drink. Jonah said nothing, only watched. Another morning, he spread hay a few feet from the corral. Ironhoof snorted, circled like a predator, then stepped forward to feed. Every move was guarded, but it was movement all the same. Jonah counted each one as a step forward. Of course, there were setbacks. More than once, Ironhoof charged, sending Jonah sprawling. Once the stallion's shoulder clipped him hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Another time, a hoof grazed his thigh, leaving a bruise purple as midnight. Each time, Jonah lay gasping, every bone aching, and each time he rose again. "Not today," he muttered through clenched teeth. "You don't get rid of me that easy." Little by little, man and beast circled each other, testing boundaries. A step too close, and Jonah learned to retreat. A gesture too sharp, and Ironhoof learned to stop short. It was no truce, not yet. But it was something new, a rhythm that might one day become understanding. From a distance, to anyone watching it, looked like folly, a broken cowboy chasing a monster through dust and failure. But Jonah knew better. In every cautious step, every narrowed gap, he felt a thread pulling tight between them. Fragile, invisible, but real. He told himself that one day, if he kept at it, that thread might hold. And so, in the dry hollow, where even the creek had given up, Jonah, Hale, and Ironhoof began their hard, stumbling dance, two survivors bound not by choice, but by the same stubborn refusal to surrender. The heat had held the valley in its grip for so long that Jonah could hardly remember the smell of wet earth. Dry Hollow had lived up to its name, wind-scoured, cracked, a place where even the cottonwoods looked brittle enough to snap. Then, without warning, the sky shifted. By dusk, black clouds boiled up from the western ridges. The first rumble of thunder echoed like cannon fire, rolling through the canyon, until it rattled the poles of Jonah's tent. The wind followed, tearing down the hollow with a force that bent grass flat and lifted dust into the air like smoke. Jonah pushed against the flap of his canvas shelter, squinting into the sudden storm. Rain came next, not a drizzle but a flood, hammering the ground in sheets that turned dust to mud in minutes. The dry creek bed, silent for months, began to gurgle as rivulets gathered and raced downhill. Jonah wrapped his blanket tighter, shivering as he crouched inside the tent. Through the blur of the water, he saw Ironhoof. The black stallion stood in the open, massive body, outlined against the jagged streaks of lightning. His coat was drenched, each muscle gleaming in the storm's white flash. He had the shelter of a rough shed Jonah had built, but he refused it, choosing instead to brace himself against the sky's fury. Head-high, ears pinned, he looked less like a beast and more like something conjured from the storm itself. His eyes glowed when lightning split the heavens, and in them Jonah saw defiance that matched his own grief. Jonah's first instinct was to stay put, but something in him broke loose. He grabbed the old oilskin coat, the only shield he owned, and staggered into the storm. The rain pounded his shoulders, cold and sharp as nails. Each step sank into fresh mud, dragging at his boots. I must be crazy, he muttered, half to himself, half to the woman he wished were still there to argue with him. Ironhoof tossed his head, snorting as Jonah drew near. The rope tied to the post trembled with every surge of muscle. Jonah slowed every nerve alive with the knowledge that one wrong move could end with a shattered ribcage. Still, he kept going, coat clutched in his hands. The stallion's ears flicked back. He stamped once hard enough to send mud flying, but he did not lunge. Jonah raised the coat then. With careful, deliberate motion, he draped it over Ironhoof's broad back. For a heartbeat, everything hung still. The horse flinched, muscles shuddering under the sudden weight, but he did not throw the man aside. Jonah stood close enough to feel the warmth of the beast under the rain-chilled hide, close enough to hear the hiss of his breath. He whispered low, almost drowned by the storm, "Easy, big fella. Just a coat. Just a little kindness." Ironhoof trembled once and then stilled. Jonah stepped back, leaving the coat where it hung. His chest heaved, water pouring down his face, but his eyes stayed locked on the stallion's. For the first time, Ironhoof's gaze lacked the wild edge of fury. There was no charge, no violent refusal, only a wary, unspoken question. Jonah eased down under the lean-to rein, slicing across his cheeks. He sat there through the night, back against the crooked posts, watching. Ironhoof remained in the open head, lowered slightly, letting the rein run off the borrowed coat. He did not fight the rope. He did not scream his rage into the storm. He simply stood the man close by the night, wrapping them both in thunder and silence. It was the first quiet night since Jonah had brought him here. When dawn came, the storm had washed the valley clean. Sunlight spilled soft and rose-colored over the ridges. Patches of steam lifted from the ground where rain still clung. Jonah pulled stiff muscles upright, wiping grit from his eyes, and turned toward the stallion. Ironhoof was still there, the coat heavy on his back. His mane hung dripping, tangled, but his eyes no longer burned with raw defiance. He stood like a sentinel after battle, wary but calm. Jonah gathered a handful of hay, dry enough inside the tent to be edible, and stepped toward him. His boots sank in the softened earth, his heart hammering. "Morning, boy," he said softly. "Let's try again." Ironhoof's ears twitched, but he didn't rear. His muscles tensed, but his hooves stayed planted. Jonah moved slower than he ever had in his life, inch by inch, until he stood close enough to feel the heat rising from the great body. The smell of horse-wet hair, raw power, wildness wrapped around him. His hand trembled as he reached out. For weeks, every attempt had ended in violence. This time, his calloused fingers brushed damp hide at the base of Ironhoof's neck. The stallion snorted, body stiff, but he did not strike. Jonah held his breath, pressing his palm flat against the wet sheen of muscle. The moment lasted forever. Jonah exhaled shakily. His throat was raw, his eyes stung with more than rain. He stroked the neck once, voice breaking into a whisper. "That's it. I'm not here to hurt you." Ironhoof's nostrils flared. A deep breath rushed out mist in the cool morning. His massive head dipped slightly, not submission, but not rejection either. For Jonah, it was a miracle. He stood there until his legs shook hands steady on the black hide. The stallion allowed it, even shifted slightly, as though adjusting to the unfamiliar weight of trust. Jonah knew it wasn't conquest. It wasn't ownership. It was something far more fragile, permission. Anna's voice returned to him, then clear, as if she were standing in the meadow. Sometimes all it takes is a single kindness to change the course of everything. His chest ached at the memory, but for the first time in months, the ache carried hope. That afternoon, Jonah tried something bolder. He opened the corral gate and tugged gently at the rope. Ironhoof snorted, pawed once. But when Jonah stepped forward, he followed. Slowly, cautiously, but he followed. They walked a few yards beyond the broken fence line. Jonah held his breath the whole time, waiting for an explosion that never came. The stallion's hooves struck mud, his massive body swaying with each deliberate step. Jonah glanced back, a grin spreading across his weathered face before he could stop it. It was the first real smile he'd worn in months. One not born of memory or mask, but of living possibility. "Well, Anna," he murmured under his breath, "maybe I ain't lost it all just yet." Behind him, Iron Hoof snorted again as though echoing the thought. Dry Hollow had been a graveyard of dreams. But now, in the hush after storm, it became something else. A place where trust had been planted, fragile as a seed strong enough to grow. By late summer, Silver Creek carried the weary air of a town, wrung out by heat and hunger. Dust lifted off of wagon wheels and boots, hanging in the air like a curtain that refused to fall. The riverbeds were low, the pastures brittle. Men leaned on fence posts at the edge of the auction yard, speaking in tones that carried the frustration of too many failed seasons. News spread quick that morning. Silas Boone had a problem. Boone was a rancher whose word carried weight across 3 counties. He was past 60 but broad as an oak, his beard silver, his eyes sharp as the day he'd first broken horses on Red Mesa. Folks said if Silas called for help, you knew it was serious. And what he needed now was no small thing, a fallen tree. Not just any tree, a massive oak knocked down in the storm that had drenched the valley weeks earlier. Its trunk was thicker than a man was tall, its branches sprawling like the arms of a giant. Silas wanted the timber salvaged to rebuild a collapsed barn and reinforce a crumbling bridge on his range. The wood was worth saving, but it lay deep in the foothills, wedged against rocks where wagons couldn't reach. He'd already tried the usual way. 4 of his strongest draft horses had been harnessed, whips cracked, men shouting encouragement until their throats bled. But the oak hadn't budged an inch. The ground gave way before the tree did. By noon, the story had settled like a stone in the town square. At the general store outside, the blacksmith's men shook their heads. Too heavy. Should have cut it where it lay. No horse alive could drag that beast out. The mood was sour frustration piling on top of the constant grind of drought and debt. Jonah Hale heard the talk as he passed a sack of flour slung over one shoulder. He stopped in the shade of a porch, listening, his face unreadable. Somewhere inside, something stirred. Silas Boone himself stood among the crowd arms, crossed jaw tight. He was explaining the failed attempts when Jonah set down his sack and stepped forward. "I might have a horse for the job," Jonah said. The words dropped like a stone in still water. Heads turned. A few mouths twisted into grins before the laughter broke out. "Lord above, he means the black devil. Better hope the tree don't stomp him to death when it rolls over. His beast'll smash the wagon before it moves that trunk." Jonah didn't flinch. He met Boone's gaze directly. The old rancher studied him in silence, weighing a man whose reputation had been mostly pity and ridicule since his ruin. "You sure?" Hale Boone asked at last, voice deep steady. "This ain't a stunt for applause. That tree's not moving easy, and your horse—" He hesitated, searching for the word. "Well, he's not exactly reliable." Jonah's jaw tightened, but his voice came out calm. "Give us one chance. That's all I ask." The crowd buzzed with disbelief, but Boone's nod cut through the noise. "Tomorrow morning at the edge of the hollow. Let's see what your monster can do." The next day, people came as if it were a show. Ranchers' hands, children perched on fence rails, they all gathered where the forest broke into a clearing. The oak lay waiting, half sunk in the mud, branches stripped back, but trunk still vast as a small house. Ironhoof was already there. The stallion's black coat gleamed in the cool morning light, muscles shifting beneath the hide like rolling boulders. His breath steamed white in the chill air, ears flicking at every sound. Some men stepped back instinctively, hands brushing the handles of their knives or whips. Jonah ignored them. He worked slow, methodical, tightening the crude harness he'd fashioned from ropes and chains. His hands were steady, though sweat dampened his temples. Each knot he tied felt like sealing a pact not just with the horse, but with fate itself. "Man's gonna get himself dragged to death," someone muttered. "He can't even feed himself proper, and now he's playing Samson with a demon horse." Jonah pretended not to hear. He rested a hand on Ironhoof's thick neck. The stallion shifted but didn't pull away. "Easy, boy," Jonah murmured. "Just you and me again. One step at a time." Boone stood apart, arms folded, eyes narrowed. He said nothing, neither mocking nor encouraging, just watching. When the last chain was fastened, Jonah stepped aside and patted Ironhoof's shoulder. The clearing held its breath. "Now, big fella," Jonah said softly, leaning close so only the horse could hear. "Let's show them what we've got." Ironhoof threw his head back, a thunderous neigh ripping through the trees. Then his hooves struck the ground like war drums. The harness jerked taut, the chains groaning under sudden strain. The oak shivered but did not move. A ripple of laughter rose from the crowd. "Knew it. Not even a twitch. Guess the monster's good for nothing after all." Jonah pressed a hand to Ironhoof's neck, whispering against the storm of doubt. "Don't listen to them. Just me. Only me. I believe in you." The stallion blew hard through his nostrils, lowering his head. Muscles bunched along his shoulders, cords of power coiling like ropes drawn tight. With a guttural roar that belonged more to legend than to flesh, Ironhoof heaved forward again. This time the tree shifted. Just an inch, then another. The mud groaned, sucking at the roots, still clinging to earth. But the trunk slid forward. Gasps drowned out laughter. Holy Christ, it's moving. No horse could. Step by step, Ironhoof dragged the impossible weight into the clearing. His hooves gouged furrows deep enough to bury a hand. Sweat mixed with rainwater still clinging to his coat, spraying in arcs with every surge. The sound was elemental chains, clanking wood, grinding the ground itself, protesting as if forced to surrender its burden. Children climbed their fathers' shoulders to see. Hardened ranchers leaned forward, mouths open. The tree that had humbled 4 horses now slid across the dirt, pulled by one black giant with fire in his eyes. Jonah walked beside him, matching pace, hand steady on the rope. He didn't shout, didn't whip. He simply moved with the beast, murmuring low encouragements only the horse could hear. When Ironhoof hauled the trunk into the open space beyond the tree line, he stopped of his own accord. His chest heaved sides, glistening with sweat, but his head lifted, high nostrils flaring as though demanding the world witness what he had done. For a long second, no one spoke. The only sound was the rasp of the stallion's breathing. Then the silence cracked. My God, 4 horses couldn't do it. And he made it look like nothing. Never seen the like in my life. Jonah laid a hand against Ironhoof's neck. The stallion turned his great head slightly, amber eyes catching the morning sun. Jonah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belonged to a man who'd glimpsed hope for the first time in years. Silas Boone strode forward, boots crunching in the dirt. He studied the tree, then the horse, then Jonah. At last, his gravelly voice carried across the crowd. "You're not crazy, Hale. You just might have found us a savior." The words hit harder than applause. They turned the tide of opinion in an instant. The laughter that had chased Jonah through town for months was gone. In its place rose murmurs of respect, of something almost like reverence. Men who'd once pitied him now stared with new calculation. Women who dismissed him as broken whispered to one another. Even children looked at him differently, their eyes wide, as if they were seeing not a ruined drifter, but the beginning of a legend. Jonah said nothing. He only stroked the stallion's neck, pride swelling where despair had long made its home. That evening, the two of them walked the road back toward Dry Hollow. The sun sank low, spilling red light across the mesas. Dust rose in small clouds behind their steps. Jonah felt the weight of eyes on him, even as he left the town behind. People lingered at porches, pausing at chores, their gazes no longer filled with scorn. They watched him go with curiosity, with something closer to hope. He tightened his grip on the rope that led Ironhoof. The horse plodded beside him, shoulders rolling like storm waves, head tossing in the glow of sunset. "You proved them wrong today," Jonah said softly. "But more than that, you proved me right. I knew there was something in you worth fighting for." The stallion gave a low snort, almost like agreement. Jonah glanced back once at the town, fading into dusk. The jeers, the pity, the shame, all of it seemed smaller now. The path ahead was no easier, but it no longer felt like a road walked alone. Dry Hollow waited, and with it, whatever future a man and a beast might forge together. Jonah knew today's trial was only the beginning. Strength had been proven. Trust was growing. But battles larger than a fallen tree loomed on the horizon. He lifted his chin eyes on the dark ridges. For the first time since Anna's death, he felt the ember of purpose stirring inside. Ironhoof was more than a horse. He was the reason to keep moving. The tale of Ironhoof spread through Red Mesa like prairie fire. Word of the black stallion dragging the oak into daylight reached every saloon, every mercantile counter, every ranch kitchen. Men repeated it over their coffee, children reenacted it with stick horses, and women told it in low tones that mingled awe with disbelief. For the first time in years, Jonah Hale's name was spoken without pity or scorn. Yet beneath the excitement, other whispers began to take root. At first, it was only murmurs carried on the wind at the Silver Creek stockyards. Frontier Holdings, a corporation out of the city, had been sending agents into the valley. Men in pressed suits and polished boots, driving cars with tinted windows, visiting ranch after ranch. They carried contracts and checkbooks, and their offers were too tempting for some to ignore. Old ranchers who had lost sons to war or drought found themselves suddenly courted. A few signed over their land, pocketing sums that seemed impossible in such hard times. "They paid me more than the whole place is worth," one gray-bearded herdsman admitted at the barbershop. I couldn't say no. But as the weeks passed, the pattern sharpened. The parcels being bought weren't random. They clustered around the creek beds, the draws, the lowlands where water still lingered beneath the soil. The prices were high enough to spark envy, but the unease was higher. "They're not here for cattle," someone muttered in the feed store. "No corporation spends that kind of money on grazing. They're after something else." The rumors multiplied, carried from porch to porch until they became less speculation than certainty. Frontier Holdings was circling Red Mesa like buzzards, and no one could quite see the bones they meant to pick. Then came Victoria Langford. Her arrival was impossible to miss. 3 black cars rolled into town on a Saturday morning, tires hissing against the dusty street, chrome gleaming in the sun. Children stopped their games, mouths open, as the procession pulled up before the old courthouse. From the rear car stepped a woman in a tailored suit the color of ash. Victoria Langford carried herself with the precision of a blade. Her hair, pale as corn silk, was pinned tight. Dark glasses masked her eyes until she removed them with deliberate grace, revealing irises sharp and pale as winter sky. She smiled, but the curve of her mouth was thin. Practiced the kind of smile that promised contracts rather than comfort. Rumor already painted her as a predator. Folks said she had stripped a mining town in Utah, bare turning neighbors against each other with the stroke of a pen. The company made millions. The people scattered like dry leaves. Whether the details were true mattered less than the fear they stirred. In Red Mesa, her reputation grew with each visit. Whenever she came, another deed changed hands. Families who had held their spreads for 3 generations suddenly sold and moved on. Some swore she had a way of making a man believe he was drowning, and only her offer was the rope to cling to. "She never raises her voice," one rancher whispered. "Doesn't have to. It's like being in the same room with a rattler. You feel the bite coming before you hear the rattle." Every appearance of the black convoy left the town buzzing, and every departure left the valley smaller. What Frontier promised was dressed in the language of progress. The brochures showed tidy rows of crops, new housing developments, paved roads, schools, clinics. Their representatives spoke of modernizing the valley, lifting it into prosperity. But behind the gloss, darker truths leaked out. A junior surveyor drunk in the saloon let slip talk of an aquifer beneath Red Mesa, an underground river vast enough to slake the thirst of distant cities. Others whispered about test drills sunk into the Western Hills pumps that hummed at night. If Frontier tapped that water on an industrial scale, the valley's fate was sealed. Cattle would die, grasslands would wither, the last creeks would vanish. Red Mesa would be left a husk, while the water was shipped away in tankers and pipelines. Those who knew enough to speak fell quiet quickly. Some were bought off with checks as fat as the lies that came with them. Others received veiled warnings, accidents on lonely roads, barns set ablaze by lightning fences cut in the dark. By the time autumn crept close, it was no longer rumor. It was inevitability. Jonah heard it plain one afternoon at the blacksmith's. He was waiting for a rasp to be sharpened when 2 men came in talking low, but not low enough. They sunk another test, well up by the western ridge, one said, leaning against the counter, already pulling samples. "Word is the flow's bigger than they thought." "Bigger," the others snorted. "Hell, they'll bleed this valley dry." The hammering of the smith's forge drowned the next words. But Jonah had heard enough. His hand stilled on the workbench, knuckles whitening. Images struck him like blows. Anna at the kitchen table coughing until her body shook. Anna carrying buckets half her weight from a spring that ran lower every day. Anna lying in the dim light, lips, cracked heart failing. He had blamed the drought, the sky, the merciless hand of nature. But what if it hadn't been nature at all? What if it had been men in suits, stealing the water out from under them, dooming her long before her time? The thought clawed at him, black and merciless. Rage surged, sudden and choking. He gripped the rasp so tight the edge cut into his palm. "If that's true," he whispered, voice shaking with fury, "they didn't just kill this valley. They killed Anna." The sound of his own voice startled him. He shoved the tool back onto the bench, barely noticing the smear of blood. The smith called after him as he walked out, but Jonah didn't hear. His mind was a storm of grief and fury, a storm that made Ironhoof's wildest tantrums look tame. The valley itself split under the pressure. Some ranchers looked at Frontier's offers and saw salvation. "Sell now, and at least we leave with money," they argued at the saloon. "Better than starving out here till the dust buries us." Others bristled. "Sell and we lose everything, our land, our water, our history. Red Mesa ain't Red Mesa without the dirt under our boots." Voices rose in the mercantile at Sunday service across dinner tables. Neighbors who had worked fence lines together now refused to share a drink. Frontiersmen smiled quietly from the edges, letting the arguments do their work. Division cost them nothing. Unity would have cost them everything. One evening at the church, the argument turned into shouting. An old rancher named Tate slammed his fist on the pew. "I got grandkids to feed. If Frontier wants to pay me double what my land's worth, I'd be a damn fool to say no." Across the aisle, a woman answered with fire in her eyes. "You sell, and your grandkids won't have a home to come back to. You think they'll care about your bank account? When this place is dust." The congregation split down the middle, the preacher powerless to quiet them. The morning broke quiet, but the sound of hammers shattered the stillness before the sun was high. By the time Jonah reached the ridge above Red Mesa's common pasture, the hollow clatter of steel echoed from every direction. Below him, men in yellow hard hats moved like ants, unrolling chain-link panels, driving posts into the ground with hydraulic drills. Frontier holdings had come at last, and they hadn't come quietly. For generations, the wide pasture had been free land. Families had driven cattle there in spring, sharing water and grass when drought made private ranges too lean. It wasn't written into law, it was older than law, a covenant held in calloused hands and silent nods. But now, gleaming fences were being raised, cutting off the grass, sealing away the water. Children cried at the sight of their family's cattle pacing behind barbed wire, lowing in confusion. Men clenched fists at their sides, rage in their faces, but fear in their eyes. Frontiers workers wore uniforms, carried paperwork, and stood under the shadow of a corporation that had the governor's ear. To strike back would mean breaking the law, or at least the law as the powerful defined it. The air carried the reek of fuel, the ringing of sledgehammers, the iron song of progress turned weapon. Jonah Hale's teeth ground together until his jaw ached. He saw Anna then. In memory, her lips cracked from thirst, her body trembling from coughing fits as dust storms scoured their land. He saw her grave under the cedar cross the parched earth around it. The rage that filled him was hotter than the desert sun. "They'll take everything," he muttered, voice hoarse. "And they'll keep taking as long as we stand still." A rancher beside him shook his head. "Don't be a fool, Hale. You can't fight them. The law's on their side." Jonah's eyes burned like coals. He turned to Iron Hoof, the giant horse shifting impatiently beside him, muscles quivering like drawn cables. Jonah laid a hand on his neck. "Maybe the law ain't always right," he whispered. Jonah didn't call for allies. He didn't gather speeches or raise banners. He walked down into the hollow alone, rope looped through Iron Hoof's halter boots, sinking into red dust. The townsfolk followed from a distance, curiosity warring with dread. A boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "What's Mr. Hale doing?" She pulled him back with a pale face. "Trying to die, most likely." Jonah stopped before the fence. The workers paused, uncertain. One called out, "This is frontier land now. You can't be here." Jonah ignored him. He tightened the makeshift harness around Iron Hoof's chest, not cinched hard enough to hold against fury. He leaned close to the stallion's ear, voice low. "They think this land belongs to them. Let's prove it don't." Iron Hoof snorted, stamping the ground. Dust rose in a halo around his hooves. Jonah stepped back and gave a single nod. "Now." The stallion lunged forward. The impact rattled the valley. Steel shrieked as the fence shuddered, posts wrenching against the ground. The sound was a scream of metal against raw power. Sparks flew where bolts tore loose. The crowd gasped. Iron Hoof backed up, pawed the ground, then threw himself forward again. His chest hit the fence with a force that made the earth tremble. This time, posts ripped from the soil, snapping free like kindling. The chain link toppled in a storm of sparks and dust. "Sweet Lord," someone breathed. The workers scattered, dropping tools, diving out of the way as Iron Hoof tore through the barricade. Jonah shouted, his voice carrying like a rifle shot, "Go, take them out." An Iron Hoof reared bellowed a cry that rolled like thunder, then wheeled toward the herd trapped inside the new fence. The cattle, skittish and half-starved, lifted their heads at the sound. For a moment they hesitated. Then the stallion plunged forward, mane flying, hooves cracking against earth. The herd followed. Like a dam bursting, they surged after him, pouring through the gap, bawling in relief as they stampeded toward the open range. Dust rose in a golden cloud, hiding horse and herd alike, until they became a single storm rolling across the valley. Jonah ran after them, rope still in hand, heart pounding with a joy he hadn't felt since his youth. On the ridges, townsfolk watched with wide eyes. The black monster they had once mocked and feared was now their champion. He wasn't smashing fences for chaos. He was freeing their cattle, protecting their way of life. "Look at him go," one man whispered. "He's leading them," another said, wonder in his voice. Like he was born for it. Children who had once clung to their mothers now clapped and cheered, voices ringing high. A woman wiped tears from her eyes as she whispered, "We called him cursed. And now, he's saving us." The workers made no move to stop it. They stood pale and shaken, powerless before the sheer force of muscle dust and destiny crashing through their barriers. Their drills and paperwork seemed like toys in the face of it. When the herd broke fully into open grassland, Iron Hoof slowed, chest-heaving sides glistening with sweat. He stood tall at their head, snorting clouds of steam, his eyes burning bright. Back at the shattered fence line, silence fell. Clint Weaver, the auctioneer, had been among the onlookers. He had watched Jonah trade away his wedding ring for this beast, had shaken his head at the madness of it. Now he stood, pale lips parted, staring at the stallion as if seeing him for the first time. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "Maybe we were wrong about him." The word spread like a ripple through the crowd. Heads nodded slowly. Eyes turned not with contempt, but with awe. Where once they had seen a monster, they now saw a leader. Jonah didn't speak. He only rested a hand on Iron Hoof's wet neck, pride swelling in his chest. The horse's breath rattled against his palm, hot and alive. Jonah looked at the broken fence, at the freed herd, and let the moment stand. For the first time, Red Mesa believed in the Black Stallion. The notices went up on fence posts, nailed to church doors, slipped under saloon counters. By dusk, everyone in Red Mesa had heard. Frontier Holdings was calling a community meeting at the town hall. The language on the flyers was polite, almost generous opportunity, partnership, relief from hardship. The promise was simple: sell your land for cash, and your family would never know drought again. For a town battered by years of dry seasons, the invitation was honey poured thick. That evening, the courthouse lamps glowed bright against the dark, and wagons and trucks lined the square. Men in weathered coats, women in Sunday dresses, children clinging to their mothers' skirts, every seat inside was filled, every wall lined. Curiosity brought them, hope brought them, and fear kept them from staying home. When the clock struck 7, the double doors opened, and Victoria Langford stepped inside. She looked more like a senator than a rancher's guest. Her ash-gray suit was crisp, her heels clicking smartly on the wood floor. She moved with the calm precision of someone who knew she was the most powerful person in the room. 2 assistants flanked her, carrying briefcases that bulged with contracts. Victoria smiled as she mounted the dais, at the expression precise, practiced utterly, without warmth. "Friends of Red Mesa," she began, her voice smooth as polished glass. "We know the pain you've endured. The droughts, the lost cattle, the children who've gone hungry." The murmur of the crowd shifted, heads bowed. The words rang true enough. But Frontier Holdings believes in your future, she continued, spreading her arms in practiced grace. We bring resources, jobs, schools, modern clinics. We bring prosperity. All we ask is your partnership. Sell us your land, and we will give you the security you deserve. At her nod, one assistant raised an oversized check for all to see. The number written across it was obscene, more money than most ranchers would see in a lifetime. Gasps filled the room. Some clapped without meaning to. A rancher near the front whispered to his wife, "We could move to Albuquerque, buy a store, be free of this dust forever." One after another, faces lit with possibility. The weight of years of failure began to slip from their shoulders. For a moment, it seemed Victoria had already won. From the back row, a chair scraped. Jonah Hale rose slowly, tall and gaunt hat in his hand. For months, he had been nothing but a ghost in the eyes of the town. Now, after Iron Hoof men noticed him again, if only to wonder what he would dare next. His voice, when it came, was low, but carried clear. "You don't want our land." Heads turned. The crowd hushed. Jonah's eyes burned like coals in the dim light. "You want our water?" The room went still. Victoria's smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened like a hawk's. Jonah stepped forward, each word landing harder than the last. "You talk about schools and hospitals, about progress. But I've heard your drills in the Western Ridge. I've seen your surveyors. You're not here to raise cattle or plant corn. You're here to bleed this valley dry." Murmurs broke out, rising like wind through grass. Jonah's hand shook as he pointed at Victoria. "My wife died in that drought," he said, voice cracking, but strong. "Anna, she coughed herself to death, breathing dust, because the water disappeared. And I'll be damned if I let you do to this town what you did to her." Gasps filled the hall. A woman clutched her child tighter. Men shifted, eyes darting from Jonah to Victoria and back again. She didn't die because the rain failed. Jonah pressed on. She died because people like you poisoned the well and called it progress. The hall was alive now, whispers turning sharp, doubts flickering in eyes that only moments ago gleamed with greed. It was Samuel Price who stood first, a rancher with a belly gone soft, but a conscience still hard. His voice was loud, shaking with conviction. "My creek dried up last spring. Never happened before, not in 40 years. I thought it was the weather. But maybe Hale's right." Another voice rose, a woman clutching a shawl. "My boy's been sick from bad water. We couldn't figure it out. If they take the rest..." She broke off, tears choking her. The crowd churned, whispers flaring into arguments. Some clung to Victoria's promises. Others felt the first stirrings of fear, the kind that smelled like truth. The balance tipped, teetering between hope and betrayal. Victoria lifted her hand. The room fell silent, as though compelled by force. "Lies," she said calmly, her voice now sharp as frost. "Dangerous lies. This man is nothing more than a bitter failure. He speaks out of grief, not reason. He insults all of you with fantasies." She leaned forward, her tone hardening. "Frontier Holdings is backed by law, by government, by power. To resist us is to destroy yourselves. Ask yourselves, do you want to cling to dust, or do you want your children fed? Do you want to live in the past or survive the future?" Her smile returned, but this time, it cut like a knife. "Stand with us or be crushed. It's that simple." The hall trembled under her words. Some ranchers lowered their heads, cowed by the sheer force of her authority. But others sat straighter, their eyes shifting to Jonah, whose defiance still glowed like an ember refusing to die. Then from outside came a sound that silenced everything. A long, resonant neigh rising like thunder. The crowd surged to the doors, spilling into the square. Under the pale moon stood Ironhoof, tall as a legend, his black coat gleaming as though carved from shadow. Behind him milled a dozen head of cattle, restless stamping drawn to him like iron to a magnet. Children gasped, women clutched their shawls, men stared with awe. The stallion pawed the earth, raised his head, and let loose another cry. The sound rolled over the rooftops, across the valley, a reminder older than law or money, that strength lived in flesh and spirit, not contracts. In that moment, every fence broken, every herd freed, every ounce of raw defiance roared louder than Victoria Langford's promises. When the crowd drifted back inside, Victoria was already gathering her papers. Her expression was cold, her eyes glinting with fury held on a tight leash. She spoke no more of schools or hospitals. She didn't need to. The storm in her gaze promised that this fight was far from over. She left the hall without a backward glance, her convoy rumbling into the night. The townsfolk lingered in knots, their voices low-charged, uncertain, but no longer lulled by easy promises. For the first time, they'd seen someone stand up to frontier and survive. The morning broke without birdsong. A pewter light lay over Ashford Basin, flattening color, dulling edges, turning the grass to a field of bayonets. Mist gathered low in the ravines, reluctant to lift. Far off beyond the basalt crowns that ringed the valley, engines snarled awake. First a single cough of diesel, then a chorus swelling into a roar so loud it unstitched the fragile quiet. They came in lines that cut the basin like knives flatbeds, stacked with steel pipe trucks hauling drill towers graders with teeth sharp as wolves' SUVs, polished like obsidian. The convoy moved with the confidence of an army that had already claimed victory in its ledgers. Black flags on telescoping poles bore the minimalist crest of Frontier Holdings, a stylized wave imprisoned in a circle. At the head of the procession, a long, dark SUV rolled to a stop, where the earth bulged and sweated up a seam of dampness, the mother vein the survey maps had whispered about. Doors opened, boots hit dirt in practiced rhythm. Out stepped Victoria Langford. She wore gray again, a color that swallowed light. Her sunglasses mirrored the basin and the machines, the men in black tactical vests, fanning into position with the bored precision of professionals who knew they were paid more than the people they displaced. She scanned the horizon as if checking a calendar. No fear, no hurry, only inevitability. "Let's proceed," she said. Hydraulic cranes hummed. The drill mast lifted, tilting up to the sky like a cathedral spire, built not for worship but extraction. Workers in hard hats uncoiled chain link and slammed in temporary posts around the seep, and their motions efficient, indifferent. A portable fence, instant ownership. Along the perimeter, the security detail arrayed themselves in a crescent rifle slung but visible fingers near triggers' mouths, flat. Their sunglasses, like their uniforms, reflected nothing. Victoria walked to the edge of the damp earth heels, sinking slightly in the silt. As of this moment, she announced not loudly, but with such control that everyone heard, this area falls under Frontier's Special Extraction Authority. Any interference will be considered obstruction under state and federal emergency provisions. Across the basin, a handful of ranchers had gathered by habit or stubbornness, hats low against the damp air. They held themselves the way men do at funerals, chin-up, hands folded, as if respect demanded stillness. They watched the company's claim wrap around their water like wire, watched the temporary gate lock with a neat click that sounded like a verdict. Some stepped back. A few crossed themselves. Most simply looked away. Engines throttled higher. The drill's first bite into soil sent a vibration through the ground, a shudder that climbed the legs of anyone standing within 100 yards. Steel struck earth. Earth yielded. Smoke and dust swirled as the machines found their rhythm, a pounding heartbeat that said, "You are small, we are many, and you will lose." The security line tightened, a black wall in the silver morning. A grader idled with its blade, lowered like a threat. The drill hammered. The convoy's exhaust pooled in the basin floor and did not rise. For a while, it seemed the fight had never really been a fight at all. The sound reached them before the sight did, a cadence against stone, a deep rhythm like thunder taught how to walk. Hooves, hooves, hooves. Heads turned toward the low hills on the basin's northern rim, where the old trail broke from sage into rock. Something moved there, a dark crest, a ripple of motion, a figure that belonged to the older world. Ironhoof came first, black as a stormfront mane burning bronze in the weak sun. His size made a lyre of distance, each stride 8 yards. Jonah Hale sat bareheaded on his back, a coil of rope slung over one shoulder, jaw set. Behind them rode Silas Boone, wide as an anvil in the saddle, followed by a ragged column of ranchers, men and women, both whose faces carried fewer doubts than yesterday. They topped the rise and spilled down into the basin. The sight stilled even the machines. "Here they come," someone in the security line muttered, as if narrating a show he had not wanted to attend. Jonah's voice carried like a bell. "This is Red Mesa land. You don't own it." His words hit the hard morning air and cracked it open. Murmurs rippled through the ranchers. A few let out sharp, high calls like riders at a roundup. The security detail straightened, rifles lifted to low, ready barrels glinting. No safeties clicked off. There was no need for theater, but the message was the same, as if bullets had been fed into chambers. "You will stop where we decide you stop." Victoria slid her sunglasses down, just enough to let her eyes cut the distance. When she smiled, it was clinical. "You chose death over a check, Mr. Hale." Jonah's gaze did not waver. "I choose life with this land over life after it's murdered for your balance sheet." The ranchers roared approval they hadn't known they had in them. The sound startled even themselves. A few in the back took a step forward they hadn't intended to take, then kept coming. Victoria's chin tipped. A security captain lifted one hand hold. He did not lower his rifle. Ironhoof stamped once, pulling the ground up in clods. Jonah leaned down and scratched the massive neck with a tenderness that would have broken a weaker man. Then he sat tall. "Move the truck," a guard called. A white Frontier pickup had been angled across the interior service road, a barricade meant to steer foot traffic away from the drill. No one moved to obey. "Don't," Victoria said. "Let them see what lines are." Jonah answered by drawing a breath and making the smallest gesture. Ironhoof surged forward. The truck didn't stand a chance. The stallion's chest hit the side panel above the wheel well with a bone-deep clang that rang up the basin walls. Steel folded, glass burst. The pickup hopped 2 feet sideways and lay there, crippled, its alarm, bleeding a ridiculous falsetto that stopped almost at once. Guards shouted, "Back, back," but no one fired. Their rifles, so heavy a minute ago, now hung like questions. Ironhoof wheeled. Jonah slid from his back, in one practiced motion, looped the rope around a half-buried timber that had been hauled in to cradle drilling pipe and knotted it to the harness he'd built with his own hands. "Haul," he breathed. The stallion lowered his head, legs braced. With a grunt that vibrated in Jonah's bones, Ironhoof dragged the timber across the service road and into place, the end gouging a trench in soft ground. Another, then another, ranchers running to help, heaving, pushing, stacking 3 beams into a gate the machines could not pass without driving over bodies. In the noise and the dust and the astonishment, a weird calm took root. Here was a thing that could not happen, and yet it was happening, and the world had not ended. Silas Boone bellowed voice, cutting through metal and menace. Push the cattle from the far slope, hands whooped and cracked lariats, driving 100 head into the basin mouth. The animals balked at the smell of oil, then surged as one through the gap. Iron Hoof had torn in Frontier's fence, their broad bodies filling space that machines needed, turning roads into rivers of flesh. Security tried to hold a line, but you cannot aim a rifle. At a tide, you dare not shoot. They fell back 2 steps without meaning to. Those 2 steps became 4. A grader reversed with a panicked beep that suddenly sounded like mercy. On the ridge, boys from town ran crates down to the line, sandwiches wrapped in wax paper jugs of water, a battered first aid box. Women moved among the ranchers with damp cloths and sharp eyes. An old cowboy who hadn't ridden in 10 years took a rein and found his seat again. Silas raised his arms. This ground lives if we stand. It dies if we don't. It wasn't eloquent. It didn't have to be. The shout that answered him rolled across the basin like rain breaking. Victoria watched without moving. Her visor of composure never cracked, but the corner of her mouth tightened, a seam pulled too taut. She lifted her hand. The security captain walked to her, leaned close. She listened, then shook her head, almost imperceptibly. The captain returned to his line with his jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. "Mama Foreman," asked Grease, already filling the creases of his palms. "We can swing the drill 40 yards to the west out of this mess. You can swing nothing." Victoria said, quiet but lethal, "You will not give them the ground they want you to give. We are here under law. The law Jonah called, as if he'd heard her across the noise, isn't always justice." He patted Iron Hoof's shoulder. The stallion's skin twitched under his hand, alive with power. A young guard near the end of the line lifted his rifle a fraction higher. He was fresh-shaved, eyes too wide. His finger flirted with the trigger, as if he'd forgotten it was his own. Jonah saw it. So did Silas. So did every rancher who'd ever taught a son that a bad decision can take 10 seconds and cost a lifetime. "Don't," Jonah said, not pleading. The word carried. The guard swallowed and lowered the barrel. If he had fired into air, into dirt, into fear, the day would have ended differently. He did not fire. The standoff stretched. Engines idled, growled, died as fuel men, thinking of safety more than orders, cut them one by one. In the world the corporations understood, time was money. In the world of the basin, time was weather. If you could outlast the day, sometimes the night brought its own miracle. Iron Hoof breathed slow. He had learned this standing, this not bolting. The big heart that had dragged oak and shattered fences now settled into a drum. Jonah leaned his weight into the stallion's shoulder, and for a moment the man who had lost everything had in his hand the single thing he needed enough. The ranchers formed arcs around the makeshift barricade, boots sunk into clay hats tilted. A 12-year-old carried a sign he'd scrawled with charcoal, "Water is life." An old woman stood next to him and laid her hand on his shoulder as if blessing a grandson. "Frontier won't shoot cattle," someone said, not sure whether it was truth or faith, and the word spread. They can't. They won't. The line firms. The cattle breathe. The guards, all of whom had wives or brothers or mothers somewhere. Look at the animals and see lawsuits, headlines, prison. They look at Jonah and see a story that will outlive them if they pick the wrong second to flex. A radio crackled on the security captain's vest. He turned away to shield his voice, but he could not shield his posture. Orders came down a wire and collided with the reality in front of his face. He nodded once, twice, mechanically, like a man agreeing with a storm. "Sir," a worker called to Victoria, voice thin now in the widened quiet. "Do we proceed?" She stared at the drill. The cattle, the barricade, the horse, whose very existence offended the geometry of her world. She adjusted the cuff of her jacket to buy a second. The math finished itself. "Stand down," she said, every syllable precise. "For today." Relief hit the line like an exhale no one admitted to. Rifles dropped a fractional inch more. The foreman nodded too quickly, already signaling his men to secure the mast. Engines groaned back to life for the purpose of retreat instead of advance. Chains clanked. The temporary fence came down faster than it had gone up because fear works quicker than greed when you finally remember you are mortal. They didn't flee. Frontier never fled. They withdrew the way a tide does, with a promise built into the pull, "I will return." When the convoy crawled back across the basin, tires chewing the road to a rib, the ranchers parted to let them pass. Not taunting, not touching, just watching with the old, hard patience of people who have buried too many things to celebrate too early. A frontier pickup with a caved-in flank, limped by last metals, screaming a scar that would need more than a hammer to forget. Silas lifted his hat to shade his eyes as the last dust cloud unspooled into the pale afternoon. Then, as if some string had been cut, the basin erupted. Shouts, laughs, tears, hats flung into air, hands on shoulders, cheeks, forearms. Someone began to cry so hard he had to crouch, and someone else hauled him back up with a hug that would have cracked ribs on a younger man. The cattle bawled. Dogs barked, because barking is what joy feels like when you have 4 legs. And Iron Hoof lifted his head and let loose a cry that rolled through rock and man alike, not challenge this time, but answer. Dawn broke softer than anyone expected. The sun spilled across Red Mesa like honey rather than fire gilding rooftops and fence rails touching the tired streets with a glow that felt almost foreign. The basin's dust still clung to boots and wagon wheels, but the fear that had hung over the town for months seemed lighter, as if burned away overnight. On Main Street, people gathered in knots, their voices carrying not in whispers of dread, but in tones bright with relief. The men who once muttered about foreclosure now spoke with hands slicing the air, retelling what they'd seen: the black stallion tearing down a truck, the herd flooding through broken fences, the retreat of Frontier's machines. Even the children played differently. They chased each other through the square, shouting Iron Hoof's name as though it were a battle cry, their laughter sharp and unrestrained. The smell of fresh bread drifted from Mrs. Carter's bakery, a sign she'd opened early. Doors that had stayed shut in suspicion or sorrow were unlatched curtains drawn back. It was the kind of morning a town experiences only once in a generation, when fear yields, if only for a breath, to the conviction that perhaps they had done something bigger than themselves. Jonah Hale walked quietly among them, hat-low rope slung over his shoulder. He had meant to slip back into Dry Hollow unnoticed, but the townsfolk didn't let him. Ranchers nodded as he passed, some offering brief handshakes, others just the smallest lift of the chin gestures that in their world meant respect. Where yesterday eyes had followed him with pity or mockery, today they met his gaze as equals. Morning Hale. One man said, his voice thick. Jonah tipped his hat, the closest thing to a thank you he could manage. It was not a parade. There were no banners, no speeches. But in every nod, every handshake, and the way children ran without looking over their shoulders, Jonah felt it. Red Mesa had changed. By mid-morning, the shift grew impossible to ignore. The men who had called him mad, the drifter who traded his wife's ring for a demon horse, now sought him out with outstretched hands. Samuel Price clapped him on the back, hard enough to jolt his ribs. If it weren't for you and that brute, he said we'd be hauling water from empty wells right now." Jonah smiled faintly, shaking his head. "Not me. All of us. You held the line as much as I did." But the truth was plain enough for the first time since Anna's death. Jonah no longer walked alone in the valley of doubt. The town saw him now, not as a cautionary tale, but as something else, a man who had faced the storm they feared most and stood his ground. More voices followed. A woman at the mercantile pressed his hand and whispered, "God bless you." An old rancher raised his coffee mug in salute from the porch of the saloon. Boys shouted his name as they ran past, not mockingly, but with the admiration reserved for men they wanted to grow into. Jonah bore it with humility. His smile never reached arrogance. His shoulders never squared with pride. He answered each thanks with the same quiet refrain. It wasn't just me. But the fire in his eyes, once smothered to embers, burned steady now, undeniable. The man who had lived in a rusting truck, who had carried his grief like a chain, had become without meaning to the center of Red Mesa's fragile hope. That evening, the saloon filled with more than the usual card players and drifters. Silas Boone had called a meeting of sorts, though he hadn't announced it. Men and women just knew to come. The lamps glowed low, and the smell of whiskey mixed with dust and sweat. Jonah sat near the corner wishing for shadows, but Silas wouldn't let him stay hidden. The old rancher stood boots planted firm, glass in hand. His voice carried with the weight of a man who didn't waste words. The day Jonah Hale walked into that auction and laid down a wedding ring for a horse, Silas said, pausing long enough for the room to fall still, "I figured grief had made him lose his senses. I thought I was watching a man dig his own grave." No one stirred. Not a glass clinked. Silas lifted his chin eyes, sweeping the room. Turns out I was wrong. That ring didn't just buy him a horse. It bought us a future none of us would have if not for the choice he made. The words landed heavy. For a moment, silence held the room like a prayer. Then one by one, heads began to nod. Rough hands tapped tabletops. A murmur swelled into a current of agreement. Jonah lowered his gaze, throat thick. He had never expected redemption to come this way. Not through applause or acknowledgement, but through a truth spoken aloud by a man who had once doubted him. He thought of Anna, of the ring that had bound their lives, of the grave, where he had believed all hope lay buried. Now the ring's absence no longer marked only loss. It marked beginning. He closed his eyes for a breath and let the emotion crest through him like rain breaking over drought. Iron Hoof, too, was reborn in the eyes of Red Mesa. Children chalked his likeness on schoolyard walls, giving him a mane like fire and hooves like anvils. They called him Iron Horse, Steel Stallion, names that rolled off their tongues with reverence. Little girls braided their toy pony's hair and whispered that one day they might ride a horse like him. Boys stomped through dust with sticks between their legs, shouting, "I'm Iron Hoof," until their mothers shooed them inside for supper. In the bunkhouses and barns, men told and retold the story of the Ashford Basin, how the black monster had lowered his head and flipped a truck, how he'd dragged timbers into a barricade, how he had led the cattle like a general leads an army. The tale grew with each telling shading from memory into legend. Where once the stallion had been cursed as a demon, now his name was invoked with awe. The beast saved us. The beast belongs to us. Even those who had laughed loudest at Jonah's bargain with Ray Hollister now spoke more softly. Maybe it was fate, they said. Maybe that horse was meant to come here, meant to stand for Red Mesa. 6 months remade Red Mesa in ways small enough to miss and large enough to hush a room. Rains returned not in floods, but in steady visitations that stitched the soil back together. Springs that had coughed up mud during the worst years now ran clear along their stony beds, and willow shoots staked timid claims along the banks. The air changed too. It no longer wore the taste of despair. On market days, you could hear jokes again, the kind that only land people tell, half complaint, half prayer. Strangers' still hope no longer felt like a reckless rumor. Where Jonah Hale had once strung a tarp between two cottonwoods at Dry Hollow Creek, timber frames rose. He set posts deep squared corners with a carpenter's patience, and laid plank after plank until a complex took shape: feed sheds, a long, airy barn. A ring for groundwork, a corral, built stout enough to hold weather and worry. Over the gate, he hung a board he'd planed from wind-fallen oak. He carved the letters himself and sanded them smooth until the grain read like a map of years' Hale Iron Hoof sanctuary. The idea had arrived the way some truths do, quietly, then all at once. If a single horse could change a town's mind, perhaps a place dedicated to saving more could change its future. Jonah wrote the notion down on the back of a feed invoice, showed it to Silas Boone over coffee, and by evening, half the valley had pledged lumber nails and weekends. What stood there by the first autumn frost wasn't fancy. It was honest. The kind of place built by hands that had rebuilt themselves. The school bus found the sanctuary before the brochures did. Every other Friday, Miss Alvarez's fourth graders spilled out into the yard like a sunrise with shoelaces. Jonah met them at the gate, Iron Hoof looming behind him, like a shadow made kind. Rule 1. Jonah would say, squatting to their height, we move slow. Horses are big, and big things deserve gentleness. He showed them how to hold a curry comb as if it were a question, how to listen for breath before offering a palm, how to speak with their shoulders before they use their mouths. Caring for a horse, he told them, is like caring for trust, patient, steady, respectful. You can't force it. You earn it. Their first touches were brief, electric. A girl who'd never seen anything taller than a pickup laid her fingers on a rescued dun's warm neck and gasped. A boy with a stutter laughed without thinking when a bay gelding's whiskers tickled his wrist. Jonah taught them to muck a stall and praised them harder than the work warranted, because the lesson wasn't only manure and straw. It was ownership and belonging, and the old medicine of being useful. They learned the names Cinnamon, a chestnut mare who flinched at sudden movement; Ghost, gray and watchful; Huck, who'd come in with a rope-burned pastern and a mean eye that softened when he discovered hands didn't always hurt. Children drew them in crayon on construction paper and taped the pictures to the tack room door until the wood was a gallery of second chances. Sometimes, in the late mornings, when the air warmed enough to lift larks, Jonah opened the big gate and stood aside. The herd loped into the outer pasture with the controlled chaos of a river breaking winter. Hooves thudded, a music you feel under the ribs before you hear it in your ears, and the ground seemed to accept each strike with gratitude. At their head ran Iron Hoof. Age had laid a few lighter hairs along his muzzle, but the rest of him was the same, impossible black, a moving mountain, a decision in motion. He didn't dominate so much as organize. A pinned ear here, a sidelong glance there, and what had been panic in the early rescues knit itself into a pattern, circles inside arcs, changes of lead passed like secrets. Horses that had once been all flight and fire now followed him as if he carried certainty in his stride. Men who came to watch called him a miracle. Jonah thought of him as a witness. The stallion had seen the worst of people and hadn't quit us for it. He led not because he was feared, but because he was trusted, and because he trusted back. Even the cranky roan mare that had tried to savage any hand that passed her stall settled when Iron Hoof stood between her and the world. He makes a kind of room around him, Jonah told Silas one afternoon, leaning on the top rail. Everything inside that room remembers how to breathe. By the time the cottonwoods browned, the sanctuary's rhythm had become the valley's. Ranchers dropped in after checking fence to offer a couple bales or a roll of wire and left with tips on a sore-footed colt or a better way to measure hay by eye. A graduate student set up a camera to study non-coercive leadership dynamics in equine groups, which made everyone smile but also made sense. A pair of retirees who'd sold their place but couldn't stop waking at 5 found themselves teaching the Saturday volunteers how to coil a rope so it wouldn't tangle when thrown. The place drew people who needed something to fix and discovered while fixing it that they themselves were being put back together. In the slow gold of evening, when chores were done and the day's last barrow of muck left the barn floor clean, Jonah walked the fence lines the way he used to when a fence meant everything he owned. Ironhoof often fell in beside him, unhaltered hooves soft in the dust. When they reached the hill that overlooked the creek's small bend, Jonah would sit in the grass and let the light find him. The stallion stood close enough that Jonah could rest a forearm against his shoulder. He spoke then, not long, not loud. "The ring is gone," he would say, the words worn smooth by saying. But the love stayed. It just changed shape. He meant Anna, and he meant the children's laughter, and he meant the way the wind carried water's clean scent again. He meant the town that had learned to show up for itself. Grief hadn't vanished. It had found a place to stand where it could see farther. There were days when a whiff of wood smoke would punch him back to the night he'd bargained away, the last bright circle of his old life. Even then, the ache no longer emptied him. It turned instead toward motion, toward purpose. He had thought memorials were stone and dates. Here, memory built fences and taught classes and put weight back on horses that had arrived all hip and eye. "This was your idea before it was mine," he said once to the quiet, and if that sounded foolish, talking to the gone, no one was there to call it so. The breeze combed Ironhoof's mane, and the stallion breathed deep like a bellows filling. Word traveled beyond Red Mesa. A couple from downriver brought in 2 Mustangs. They'd failed to gentle, and left with a list: short sessions, longer rests, reward the try. A biologist asked to test the creek for macroinvertebrates, and returned grinning about caddisflies. A reporter came, took notes, and wrote an article that made Jonah uncomfortable with its attention, but brought in donations that paid for a new water line, and after a month's careful debate, a second-hand tractor. The sanctuary became what Jonah had never set out to build, and always hoped to see a place where people learned that belonging isn't ownership, and care is a currency that enriches everything it touches. He still repaired fences on neighboring spreads when a storm snapped posts. He still said no to people who wanted to turn the place into spectacle. He still woke once in a while before the dawn, with his heart hammering as if the earth itself had shifted beneath him. On those mornings, he stepped onto the porch with coffee cupped in both hands and listened. If the creek talked, if a distant calf bawled, if the big horse stirred in the lot and blew softly through his nose, Jonah's pulse settled. He had learned the valley's new inventory of sounds and what each one meant. Frontier holdings didn't disappear. Corporations don't fade so much as reposition. Papers were filed, lawyers tested edges, a consultant tried to charm the county board and mispronounced half the names. But Red Mesa no longer argued with itself the way it had in the hungry years. When notices went up for public comment, the town hall filled and the microphones worked, and people spoke not like a group of strangers, but like a choir that had learned how to take a breath at the same time. Jonah rarely took the podium. He didn't need to. Others had found their voices, and he preferred the rail at the back, where he could nod at a point well made and catch the eye of anyone wavering. On a dawn that arrived the blue and generous, the herd ran. It wasn't an event. It was a habit. Yet a few visitors happened to be there, and they stood as folks do when the ordinary becomes sacrament. The horses poured across the east pasture dust, lifting behind them in a ribbon that the sun turned to gold. Ironhoof led at an easy gallop that suggested eternity more than speed. The dun tucked behind his left hip. Ghost floated to the outside and then tucked back in, as if choreographed by wind. For a minute, the ground itself seemed to breathe harder to keep pace. At the crest, Ironhoof threw his head and voiced a long, rolling call. It wasn't defiance. It was a statement, presence, promise, a claim staked without paper or seal. The sound went out over Dry Hollow and down the creek and up into the broken crown of mesas until it returned as echo a softer yes. Jonah stepped onto the porch mug, warm between his palms, and let the call pass through him. He smiled, quiet, not showy, the kind that belongs to mornings without an audience. His shoulders lifted on a long inhale and dropped the weight of an old night when he exhaled. Behind him, the sign creaked once in a breeze, Hail Ironhoof's Sanctuary, and then settled. He knew challenges would come. Water always draws maps in someone else's office. But he also knew what had been built: Barnes routines, skills, a habit of standing shoulder to shoulder. Red Mesa's strength no longer depended on one horse or one man. It had diversified itself into 1,000 small loyalties that added up to a wall you couldn't see until you leaned into it. Children's voices rose from the Lane Friday field trip day, bright as sparrows. Jonah set his mug on the rail and headed for the gate. Ironhoof peeled off from the herd and trotted in, ears forward, already attuned to the ritual he had helped invent. The stallion stopped before Jonah and bumped his chest lightly, a touch that said, "Here and ready." Jonah scratched the familiar place at the base of the thick neck. "Let's get to work," he said. Work now meant brushing knots and teaching softness and taking time. It meant showing a boy how to stand where a horse could see him and telling a girl that fear is information, not a verdict. It meant watching a rescued mare lower her head into a halter without flinching and remembering the first day she'd tried to climb the stall door to get away. It meant writing down feed amounts in a careful hand and returning a borrowed trailer on time and knowing the farrier's kid's birthday. It meant building the kind of future that doesn't make speeches about itself. When the children reached the fence, their chatter spilled into the paddock like spring water. "Is he really the one?" a little voice asked. Jonah looked at Ironhoof, who merely breathed broad and untroubled. "He's one of them," Jonah said. "And so are you." The day unfolded into the business of care. Rakes clinked, laughter pealed. A small hand disappeared momentarily in a black mane and came out shining with horsehair and pride. At noon, clouds stacked friendly on the horizon, gathering into a shape that looked, if you'd learned to read the sky, like ordinary rain. By evening, the sanctuary quieted to the soft punctuation of swallows under the eaves. Jonah slid the last stall door shut and crossed the yard dust glowing at his ankles. He paused beneath the gate sign and touched the O in Ironhoof, where his knife had kicked once and left a nick only he would notice. He thought of a ring he no longer wore, and of a hand he could still feel small and strong in his. He thought of a valley that had almost died and had decided stubbornly not to. Love hadn't gone anywhere. It had simply traded metal for muscle circle, for circle ring, for hoof promise, for practice. In the hush before night, with the herd settling and the creek talking to stones that finally had something to say back, Jonah understood the only ending that ever lasts is the kind that keeps beginning.